Oh, we're seeing folks pop in and chatting in, saying that they're calling in from Seattle and just wanting to say welcome to everybody. So we're going to get started. This is our first School of Education at Mills College Teach-In. I'm Dr. Wendi Williams. I'm the Dean of the School of Education here. And this is our teach-in on abolitionist teaching. I want to just start by introducing briefly our colleagues who have agreed to serve on this panel for us today. Dr. Cliff Lee is a professor in the School of Education here. He teaches in the teacher education program and is the program director of our single subjects program here in the School of Education. Dr. Natalee Bauer is an affiliate of our School of Education and just a very good friend and colleague. She is the head of our Ethnic Studies program here at Mills College. And then Dr. Dana Wright is the head of our Administrative Services credential program here at the college and teaches in the Education and Leadership Department. So want to thank them just right off the bat when I asked them the question, I think maybe no more than 2 weeks ago, if you all would be willing to participate in a panel conversation around the importance and necessity of abolitionist teaching. They all quickly said yes, for sure. Now, what we didn't plan on, but was a brilliant surprise, was that in our Twitter post to promote our event, that Dr. Bettina Love, like myself, is pretty active on Twitter. I follow them. And so Dr. Bettina Love is the professor of educational theory and practice at University of Georgia. She is the author of this book here, We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom, put out by Beacon in 2019, just a year ago, and has really given voice and I think presence to the notion of abolitionist teaching and given that a frame during most recently, and sort of attended or has helped to attend, helped our larger culture to attend to what it means for us to teach toward liberation and freedom, for us to have truly an intersectional lens in that work. And so we're really grateful to have her join. She said, hey, I could be available that day. And I said, I would love it. And so here she is. And so it's just wonderful to be able to have her join the conversation with our colleagues. I want to say just a huge thank you. We have nearly 400 people that have registered for this event. And actually, you all have required us to extend and grow our capacity to actually hold this conversation in Zoom. But we're grateful to do it because we know that this conversation is important, and it feels even more deeply resonant that you do too. Many are alum of Mills College, and particularly our School of Education, but we have folks calling in from all over, particularly community members within our base, local Oakland, California community, but from Honolulu, Hawaii, Holyoke, Massachusetts, College Station, Pennsylvania. I saw someone coming in from Nashville, Sacramento, Durham, North Carolina, New York City, which is my old home, Kansas. We have a wide breadth and group of folks who have joined us. So I'm really grateful for the reach and also grateful for your response to be a part of this conversation with us. And lastly, before we get started, these things don't happen without having the support of just a team that is dynamic and wonderful. And I want to just give special thanks to two people who you're probably not going to see or hear from, but made this whole thing possible. And that is Gabriela Powell Cervantes. She's our Director of Administration and my assistant here at the School of Education at Mills, and Urea Bello, who is also on staff here on our administrative team. And just, again, they make our world go round, and we would just be it just wouldn't happen. So with no further ado, I want to just start by maybe entering the conversation with a few of Dr. Love's words of abolitionist teaching for the current moment, as you all see it, particularly as educators of teachers and leaders for schools right now. Overarching question, like, what is this work? What is the necessity? But, just you respond in what ways feels most useful to you.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm thinking about those 4 phases, love, protect, destroy, and build. And I feel like I get really, honestly, really, really into the destroy level. I don't know where that comes from. But, I'm thinking a lot about the questions that you asked us about just how can children thrive, or how can students thrive? Because I really want to bring in college students also, right? I spent the first 20 years of my adulthood teaching elementary school and middle school. And teaching college, I think it's really not that different, but we think it's different. So we treat it differently. So I always want us to bring that perspective back in. So anything we say is necessary K-12 is still necessary, 1 year later, basically. So in terms of, I don't know what students need, I feel like realizing I may be more of a Marxist than I thought I was, because I keep coming back to we need money, right? When I think about what it means for students in 2020 to experience joy, I think about my own child. I have two, but the 7-year-old, he's doing online learning and he's suffering, he's struggling. He's not experiencing joy. And that's not the fault of his teachers. It's the fault of the platform, right? It's the fault of what we're asking kids to do. And so for my kid to experience joy, I need us to let go of this idea of rigor and content standards and testing and this crazy idea that we can recreate an 8:30 to 3 o'clock day, and that's even necessary, right? I need him to feel seen, and I have to say, the teacher he had for his first 2 years, who's here at our children's school, I told her, I said, you know what, I'll fight somebody for you. That's how much I see that you love and care for my son, right? He would have never survived the K-1 years without a teacher who saw him and who instilled joy in him and met him where he was in his fidgety, ADHD, crazy way, right? So coming from a very socially privileged situation, I think I just want my kid to experience joy, right? But I also know that there are a lot of kids who were really struggling and suffering before this global viral pandemic happened, right? And so we want those kids to experience joy as well, but we also need to listen to their families and understand what it is that they want for those kids, right? And in order to make those things happen, we need money. We need to pay their parents to stay home. We need to pay them for healthcare. We need to pay them, we need to buy them laptops. We need to buy them Wi-Fi. We need to give them money for food. We need to make it so those families can safely stay home and take that weight of all these multiple pandemics off of themselves, so that they then can create that joy for their kids. The joy that I feel as much as I hate the current situation, it's not that difficult for me to provide for my family. I can make certain sacrifices and provide that. But it's on us, and this is a form of reparations, right? Those of us who got those tax rebates, but we didn't lose our jobs, that money's not really ours, I mean, in my opinion, right? Who can we donate that money to? Which communities didn't receive that? Which schools need that money? There are ways that there are material ways that we can help make joy possible and make thriving possible. Just stop with that for now.
It sounds like the material has really has really been a focus as we're watching the ways in which folks don't have what they just materially need. And so I definitely can see that. Cliff, what would you add to that?
I just was jotting some notes. I have a lot of different points, so I'll try to target some different areas. Just thank you first, Dr. Love, for the beautiful text. I think that I really can tell when I was literally thinking about copying and pasting certain sections. I might actually do that and send it to my parents. So I think it's amazing that if you can be that accessible and clear, even for my 70-plus-year-old Chinese immigrant parents, for them to better understand state-sanctioned policies against Black, Indigenous people of color. Because trust me, I've explained it for the last 20-plus years, but there's parts that I'm like, yes, I hope they get this. And I'm nodding throughout the text, and I'm just sharing different parts with my partner, with everybody I'm interacting with. So thank you for that. And also thank you for your willingness to share your personal stories. Love hearing your stories of Rochester and how it connects to macro sociopolitical issues in our country. So I think that makes it really connect with folks. So to be completely 100, I think depending on the day, I often notice that I personally waver between cynicism and hope. We've seen even when my partner and I walk the neighborhood, we see the Black Lives Matters posters pop up everywhere. And, part of us, when we even travel to places that I know are not a lot of POC and we see it, we're like, that's dope, that's cool. But part of us is always that's cool, but are you really, really doing the work? And are you actually it's cool you're donating $50, $100, but to me, that goes back to Freire's ideas, charity versus justice. Like, are you actually going to, give up something? Like, are you going to put in your will, like a third of your will is going to be like designated to give up, multi-generational wealth that you've accumulated as a result of like systemic oppressions of other people to change some of these systems? And that to me is like what resonates with me, what's abolitionist ideals, what we're talking about. And it's really putting ideology to practice. So on the side when I'm thinking about the more hopeful side, because, when we think about all these different layers, it's pretty overwhelming. But as a teacher educator for many years now, I think about that, like what you said, we've got to dismantle some of these institutions and systems that continue to strangle our ability to dream the world that we truly want to see and what is possible, and create the condition for all people to thrive peacefully. And part of that includes the joy. And I'm really glad that you included that. And we actually just renamed our teacher ed program to Educators for Liberation, Justice, and Joy. Just randomly. I hadn't even read your book yet. And we came up with this with Tomas Galguera and Wanda Watson. And I read that. I was like, what the heck? That's crazy. In the first part of your text. And I think that's really important, that joy part, like to have the fun and silliness together as a teacher with your students and show your creativity and imagination. And also, I often talk about this too, like as teachers, and as teacher educators and all of us, we need to do the self-work to break the chains within ourselves. And I'm totally transparent with this one. Like, I think that includes finding a social justice therapist, even someone even better if they're a BIPOC, help you move from those chains that inhibit your freedom, and think about like all your daily practices that you still perpetuate. And I do myself, that we need to recognize where it comes from, where the roots are. And also I would even add just like some of the basic things, like seek out the knowledges, histories, traditions, and brilliance of marginalized populations, especially at the resilience of intersectional movements, and share and celebrate these non-dominant histories with your students. I mean, just last night, my partner and I just finished like this documentary called Rumble. It's about Native Americans throughout music, rock music in this country. And I was blown away. I did not realize Indigenous folks have a hand and connection with like blues, jazz, swing, rock, heavy metal, even like all these, and like Jimi Hendrix part Indigenous, like all these types of intersectional histories. How many, of our folks know about this stuff? I didn't even know about some of these things. And that like this woman named Mildred Bailey influenced like Billie Holiday and all this. And so our worlds collide together in beautiful ways. These are the things that I think we need to like incorporate and celebrate and recognize. And that is part of also the work of, I feel like, abolitionist teaching. And then the other part, a couple of us just came out of like awesome meditation session with Conda Mason. And I feel like that's another aspect too. Like we got to take care of ourselves in going through this struggle. So I'll keep it at that for right now.
Cliff, thank you so much. And Dana, please.
So first, I just want to say I'm happy to be on this panel. Thanks to my colleagues, for Dean Williams and everyone for putting this together, folks working behind the scenes as well. And thank you for Dr. Bettina Love for your great book and for helping to frame this conversation here. It's really kind of, I think, touches on a lot that a lot of people have been thinking for a long time. Your book and this conversation and other conversations that are happening right now. I think, in terms of like abolitionist teaching and what it looks like, I think for us to really thrive, like we have to take back a step and think about, what is the purpose of schooling, that we need to take a step back and really, when a house has like mold in it or something, like dangerous black, like dangerous termites or black mold, like that, you might have to take it down to the studs. You might have to destroy that house and then ask, what do we want to build by the people who are going to occupy the house, right? So our students, our most marginalized students. And I think that if we focus on the folks, Black, brown, indigenous folks, queer folks, trans folks, and non-binary folks who were migrated here, right? First-gen students, also students that are labeled with a disability, or, you know, all of it, right? I think if it can ripple out to everyone, right? Our Asian students, our Middle Eastern students, like all the intersections, right? Our girls, I think it needs to really focus on asking, you know, a lot of times in academia, I think we are so refreshed when we're dismantling that idea of who's the expert, right? So to me, I think asking what is the purpose of schooling, I think about, you know, we're in this moment where people are not wanting reform. People are not wanting Band-Aids or, you know, putting a new coat of paint on the house that has termite damage, right? So we need to actually note that these dual pandemics or triple pandemics, right? We have some wonderful, inspiring uprisings around Black Lives Matter and racial justice, right? Inspired by, you know, state violence. We have the pandemic that's really laying bare our social inequities in terms of race and no social safety nets. We have an economic crisis, right? And that people are seeing that our systems, there's no social safety nets. So we need to, in a lot of conversations that I've been a part of, people are really talking about how do we build new structures, institutions, systems with the new paradigm, right? So really thinking from that centered place of doing our own work, our own healing, our own feeling joy and stepping into that, and really imagining outside of the current structures and dominant norms, thinking outside the box. Like, what is the purpose of schooling? How can that feel if we feel liberated ourselves and as educators, students, right? It has to be a collective conversation, because if we leave people out and they're not at the table, we're not going to be able to build what it is that we need to build. So I have other things to say, but I want to just kind of pause there and have us really, you know, I think threading together what we're all saying on the panel, I think is really beautiful to hear. And I think we're really talking about the purpose of schooling and new systems, new paradigms, stepping away from a form to build something really new.
Dana, I think that's a perfect segue, because, you know, one of the things that's happening right now, even as we use this terminology, abolish, right? And the abolish the police, defunding the police, there's this reactionary that we see happening in the public. You know, folks wonder, what are you going to do if you don't have this thing? Even folks who are oppressed in communities that are oppressed and are challenged and are abused by this system, some still wonder, what are we going to do without this thing? I think, Dana, where you land us in your comments is a great place to continue forward in terms of what are these pieces of an abolish, like what does, if we were to take it down to the studs, what are the bricks? What is the frame? What are the starts? And, you know, I'm not asking for any of us to have the solid foundational answer, right? But in a shared community of thinkers right now and learners right now, Natalee, Cliff, and Dr. Love, I know you have to go in 2 minutes, so maybe we hear from you first. But, you know, chime in around what would be the pieces of that? You all have mentioned some things already. Joy is there. How do we cultivate joy? What are ways in which the curriculum and the staffing experiences, the hiring, the whole element of, like, what is a school? What is a school? What would actually contribute? What goes in? What are the recipe? What are the ingredients for this recipe of building a new vision for education that is abolitionist, that is thriving and really creating space for love and joy of learning?
Oh man, something that well, first of all, I want to start with I'm putting a link in the chat. So one thing we didn't talk about is that, you know, we're currently on stolen land, right? Wherever we are. In Oakland, we're on land that belongs to the Ohlone people. So if you appreciated this forum today, you can click on that link and you can actually pay the Shumi land tax, right? So that's one way we can make real change. The other thing that, you know, Cliff was talking about putting things in your wills, right? I'm like, man, you know what? Put in your wills, like, when I pass this intergenerational wealth, this house, this is going to go back to the Ohlone people, right? This is going to go into this land trust. You have that link right there, right? But to go back to her questions around who am I, who are your people? And how do we use that to think about this movement? I think two things. One is, this is not something new, right? We've seen this before. The thing is that many of us who are experts in the field, who have these degrees and all of this, like, we might want to step back and consider that maybe we're not the experts around this, right? Like, maybe we actually need to go to the communities and see what their vision is for imagining a just future, right? And we know that it's been done before and it's worked, right? You can look at Oakland Community School that was started by the Black Panthers, right? That was all community built. It didn't take state and federal funds, right? It was what does our community need and how are we going to collectively provide it, right? And even pre, segregation, like Black schools were short on money, but we're wealthy in community knowledge and in education and in care and love, right? Like, there were successful schools that have existed. If you look at Hawaii, if you look at the schools that have been created now that are culturally based and language based, like there's so many models of how this can be done if we come to the community and see the community and the families as experts, not as folks who we need to come and save, right? Not as folks who have a deficit or who have a need that we can fill. That we just have to kind of step back and let go of that expert role and listen. And then the other idea of, like, who am I and who are your people, like, this just keeps bringing me back to the stats of, upward of 80%, over 80% of the teachers in our schools are white people. They're white women, right? So what does it mean that your goal is to come into communities of color, to serve, to love, to say, well, whatever, rather than choosing to go teach in the communities where you came from, right? Because, like, that's where that need is, in my mind. We need those progressive white teachers in the suburbs. We need them in their own communities, right? Like, we need them dismantling the myths that make it okay for a 17-year-old white boy to wander around with a rifle, right? And be seen as just a troubled kid who had been bullied, right? Like, we need them there. So I get the who is my community, who are my people, and how can we build this dream for our Native kids, our kids of color, but also just being realistic and knowing who is in education. I think that, it's time for folks to have a really, like, honest, discussion with themselves. That kind of sounds a little weird, but, to have a look at themselves and think, like, where can I actually do some constructive good? Where am I needed? Do people need me to save them? Right? Hint, that the answer is no. But where can I really make some progress? And, I think, and my colleagues and I in the School of Education, we talk about this all the time. Why are there so many schools whose credential programs are, have the word urban ed in them, right? Or, like, teaching for urban schools. Like, where are the teaching for suburban schools, right? Where are those programs? Those are needed, right? Like, those are really needed. So I don't even know that I answered the question. That's just what came to my mind based on, what Dr. Love was recently saying. And
absolutely. Yeah. And we're right now, we're in the imaginary, right? We're visioning, if you take it down to the studs, as Dana, I love Dana's metaphor, right? If you take it down to the studs, then what are you rebuilding? Cliff, Dana, what would you add to that?
Yeah. I'm really stuck on the idea of just, like, for myself, like, and I think a lot of teachers and teacher educators, we're so beholden by the state standards of, like, what is, they're determining what is to be taught, what is to be learned, how the schedule of the school day looks like, and all these different things. So that's why I kind of turned to, like, examining what roadblocks or blinders we currently have that are not allowing myself and others to be able to even reimagine what it could look like. And as Natalee and Dr. Love was talking about, it made me think about that separating between teaching and learning and schooling, because too much we're talking about schooling and what's been done, and that's like the old way, right? But reimagining what teaching and learning could actually be. And I actually think we do have a lot of research that's been done to show what does good teaching and learning look like, not necessarily even within a school, space, right? And that means maybe not necessarily having, like, you still have the normative tradition of, like, periods and, like, different disciplines and, like, school time from this time to this time that's modeled after a factory, right? Like, why do we still operate in that way? Like, one 6-year-old and one 9-year-old might not necessarily have to be in separate classes, right? And so I really like what Natalee said, and that's kind of like what I was going to start with, like starting with the community, like asking folks like, what are some of the ideas, concepts, values, skills that you feel like you need to pass on to the next generation to dream of the world that we want to see, right? And that requires time and contemplation, and also, again, dismantling some of our own thoughts and hindrances, because we've all been schooled in the same system. And for the ones that are on this panel for a long time, right? And so how do we dismantle those in our minds? And I even think of like some of the practices that do exist. And we have, you know, I feel like I've been lucky in that I've been in spaces in pretty innovative schools and out of school spaces that have done things that are not the traditional type of thing. And we have successes in those areas. I mean, think about like, you know, if there's more genuine, like interdisciplinary project-based learning type of learning. And I feel like some parents lately during this distance learning, myself included, have started thinking about like, hey, when a young person's interested in this topic, how do we actually design something that explores that? And also with the explicit goal of changing the current structures that, you know, block us from doing of true liberation for all groups. I think about like genuine restorative justice practices in the indigenous tradition, like those things like that, or even like experiential learning, you know, from experts like in the community versus like, you know, me just because I have this credential and degree means I know something, which doesn't necessarily mean a lot sometimes, right? So those are some of the things that I, you know, started thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Cliff. And I really like what you're saying about sort of the humility that comes along with taking a knee around our expertise and allowing for other expertise, other voices to, you know, raise up and be relevant to the situation and the context. Dana, what are some of your thoughts about that? And I'll just add here that one of our participants has a question that I think really sits alongside what we're processing here. They asked, her name is Jane, for my own learning as well as in trying to explain to others, I find concrete examples of abolitionist teaching to be helpful. So we're starting to share some of these ideas sort of theoretically and also in some concrete examples. And so what are some of those examples? And I think what we're, again, as we're in this imaginary, we're sort of thinking about like what some of those possibilities or examples are, what we may know from our circles and networks with our colleagues, and what our students and our alums are doing in schools that we also hear about.
Yeah. So I'd like to answer that in putting it a little bit in quickly history and then talking about the present examples. For me, as a biracial Black person, I think about some of my enslaved ancestors, and there was literacy of reading the word and the world right at midnight freedom schools where people were teaching each other how to read. And, you know, there's a great text called When I Can Read My Title Clear that talks about those practices and documents that, right? We have, Natalee mentioned the kind of freedom schools by the Black Panthers in Oakland, and we were lucky at Mills to have Erica Huggins here recently at the 50th anniversary of the Ethnic Studies Department that's co-hosting this, and she talked at length about being part of that, right? And how also college students and organizers and community members helped with those schools, right? And with the prerequisite programs and other things. Teach Freedom is a great book that gives some examples. So Charles Payne and Carol Strickland, who talk about education for liberation, right? In the African-American tradition, and talk about some of those schools, the Black Panther Freedom Schools, also kind of the, there were some others, right? Children's Defense Schools and other Defense Fund schools and other freedom schools in different decades, right, in this country. My work actually on participatory action research focuses in non-school settings. I do look at, you know, how it happens in schools as well, particularly middle schools and high schools. But I look at a lot of community-based settings, and they might call themselves youth organizers or you know, youth leadership development, or even kind of social movement building organizations and coalitions where there is some of the similar curriculum that we've had in history, right? And that the panelists and Dr. Love and some of the question kind of speaks to, right? So like, who am I? Who am my people? And then like in participatory action research, it's very similar in some ways to, you know, community organizing or youth organizing, where you're looking at an issue that is directly affecting the people. And though that issue is something that the people who've experienced directly have a lot of knowledge and wisdom and from their experience of being maybe marginalized by a system, right? So looking at a lot of times, whether it's a school setting or not, in participatory action research frameworks, the facilitator, usually an adult facilitator, is usually an intergenerational group, is helping the people who are directly affected, and I'm going to focus on young people, by a social issue, right? And it could be a lot of different social issues. So it could be, you know, state-sanctioned police violence against Black bodies, or it could be rounding up children and putting them in cages for some of our folks who are from migrant families, right? Or undocumented folks, like whatever those social issues are. It could be an environmental issue. It could be so many different issues. It could be, right now we have a lot of issues that are, people are connecting a lot of the dots, right? And so the first thing is just encourage them to take on the issue and then ask support through structured spaces, right? Create a process where people can do that research. Who am I? Who are my people? What is facing us and what needs to change, right? So what are the forces that are touching their lives, right? What are the root causes? And a lot of times also helping them through, and a lot of youth organizers use kind of the 4 I's of oppression, right? So the individual or internal level, institutional, the interpersonal, and then the institutional and ideological. And we have to, a lot of times in our traditional schooling, we don't, we're kind of, as the schooling process is not helping people ask those questions, or they're getting knocked down verbally or through humiliation as a discipline tactic or otherwise, when they're asking critical questions that are making people uncomfortable who maybe are invested in the status quo as adults, or at, you know, whatever their different groups are and positionalities, right? Or people with degrees, right? So we have to also look at that interpersonal as well, but focus also on the institutional. What are the institutional practices and processes? What are the, what's the ideological or the conceptual? What are the frameworks that led us to this place? What are the frameworks that led us to the fact that we can have Black folks killed with impunity in the streets and no real accountability, and uprisings, and you know, it's amazing to see some of the grassroots responses, but this is a place that we should have never come to, right? But there's reasons for that, and what are the frameworks, whether it's looking at white supremacy and its intersectionality with other forms of oppression, right? But what are those frameworks of domination, of, you know, hierarchy, of top down, like what are the frameworks that got us to this place, right? And even fear of the other and feeling superior, like at the very basic levels. I think when I've seen young people go through this and then they build their research and academic skills, right? So that's the third piece, is they kind of apply, they're asking these questions, they're gathering facts, and then they're taking on an action plan in a youth and adult partnership, right? So that's a collective action, and that can look in so many different ways. That can be direct action, that could be skits and, you know, performances, that could be art, that could be different ways of connecting the dots and talking about what the root causes are and then what the vision is, right? And it can be the action plan to begin that vision, whether it's at the policy level. You know, in my, some of my work, even just, you know, so before kind of being a professor, you know, working in the participatory action research field, you know, seeing groups where young people have a parent who is incarcerated or in jail, and that becomes a whole group, right? So that becomes we're going to do participatory action research together with some adult allies or co-conspirators, and we're going to actually speak back to the social workers and the teachers who maybe didn't have enough training to understand what we were going through when, you know, they were visiting a parent who was maybe in lockdown and upset and acting out the next day. So they actually had an interactive curriculum with icebreakers and all the things, right, for the social workers and teachers to understand how to best support them, right? And so presenting on that. So I just want to, you know, lift up some examples that I've been able to witness for, like, how do we ask these questions of how do we really, like, essentially for me, you know, at the most fundamental level, like, what does our collaborative work look like in these social movements for freedom or liberation, like fighting against systems and impacts of all of it, racialized capitalism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, right? What these systems are dying. So what does it look like that's process oriented, that's expansive, with mutual aid and support, with honesty, with vulnerability, and with joy? I appreciate that people keep talking about joy, that trust, that collectivity, that love, that's heart-centered, from a place of the collective. And that's what we're, you know, we have to be asymmetrical to the dominant paradigms, right? So what does it actually look like when we're able to build in that collective way? So I see a lot of things happening in the chat, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dana, so much. I just want to, you know, we have a couple of questions that have been brewing and popping up, and wanting to give our audience some opportunity to pose their questions to you all. Emily asked a question, I think, Dana, that I think you started to touch on a bit, and I wonder what Cliff and Natalee might say to this as well. She says, I'm a community organizer in Southern California that supports community members directly impacted by the criminal and immigration legal systems, both in detention and post-detention. How do we make abolitionist teaching accessible to community members, and which spaces exist for them to inform the teaching education processes? So it sounds like participatory action research is one way, and some of the methodologies can be sort of inserted as practices. And I just wonder what others are thinking about that. Particularly these restrictive and detention type settings. Any thoughts?
I mean, not specifically in terms of detention and post-detention, but thinking about, so Cliff and I met another lifetime ago in the Oakland small autonomous schools movement. And that came about because of community members, right? It wasn't teachers or administrators or the superintendent who thought it was a good idea. I mean, those folks certainly took it on as like their project and it was their idea, but it was family members. It was community members in Fruitvale. It was largely Latina mothers who for years were coming into principals' offices and into school districts and demanding that they be listened to. So, I mean, I feel like the answer is, I don't have the answers. But it almost feels like it's not going to be given, it has to just be taken, right? So who are community organizers? I think what happened to make it possible in Oakland was folks with community organizing experience worked together with those moms. And so we had, you know, like the Oakland Community Organization, we had Madres Unidas, we had, I mean, I don't know, so many small community organizations really just got brought together and got supported and amplified, and then got heard. And then we had this amazing movement in Oakland where we had community run schools. And we would have had them for a longer time if we hadn't had a state takeover, right? We didn't have the sort of, you know, like what Cliff was describing as like a political climate that supported it. There was a lot of distrust of it. And so I think that kind of comes back to like those of us who have access to power in whatever way, political or economic or whatever, like we have to do what we can to sort of like amplify those voices, right? Like not try to speak for them because they're already there trying to access this, right? So how do we make it more accessible?
Can I just build on what Natalee, what you shared? One of the things I knew about like OCO that, and I know they learned from in LA, was it Pico Unidas or something, right? That their strategy was to also build the leadership within the base. And I think that's so key to their leadership model and how to make things happen. Because I feel like doing within the system, yes, there are teachers, administration that can kind of lead, but I think you really need that like community grounded up approach of where, folks that have been stigmatized to be like, you don't have a voice, your voice doesn't matter, you're just this, you haven't gotten this level of education. Just to demystify that process might be the first step, right? And so like what I know they did is putting women in positions of power where they're like, hey, at this upcoming board meeting, I want you to speak. And there's definitely a lot of coaching. I mean, I feel like it's not too different than like getting teachers to be developed into teacher leaders. You need that support, and you need validation, and you need to develop that agency if your whole life has been told to you that your voice doesn't matter, your life doesn't matter. And so building that up from the ground up, that led to others feeling like, wow, I feel empowered, and other folks seeing them, they do it, then they can do it as well too. So I think that's one strategy. I feel like the detention system is so complex that is really difficult. I feel like one thing that actually reminded me of was this piece that I'm also connected with YR Media, formerly known as Youth Radio. And a couple years back, we did a story, again, it's youth-led, collaboratively with adults. We did a story called Double Charge. It was examining how like a lot of folks who are young people who had been incarcerated in the system, not only do they have to serve their time, they sometimes had to pay additional fines and fees. So they were being double charged with their, whatever happened to them, right? And so even paying for the ankle monitor, even paying for the investigation on their own situation, that coverage led to Alameda County putting a suspension on that, fines and fees that was double charging folks. And so like, this is where I see that's to me true learning that's happening, not only for the folks that's on the ground, but you're actually doing something substantive to make a change in the lives of people. And in that process, they're learning all the skills in a typical ELA classroom or social studies classroom. They're interviewing, they're collecting data, they're researching, they're writing, they're collecting video, they're collecting data, they're doing data analysis. All of these things are things that can be woven in a way that has true meaning. And when you think about like cultural responsive, sustaining pedagogy, this is to me what it means. It's also, building on the research that I do is really thinking about the multi-literacies of our young people. Like, they're engaged in technology in ways that, myself and probably most of this panel, weren't privy to, 10, 15 years ago, right? And so how do we utilize that and leverage that expertise that they have in some capacities and build upon that? And that to me is like getting them to be critical consumers and producers of media in a way that is meaningful and can transform some of the issues that they see in their community. And that also lends itself very well to like what Dana described as, the YPAR work. It's them doing the research to not just to publish a paper that is going to be for just their teacher to read and get a grade and that's it, throw it away, but it's to actually like for an authentic audience to drive change, right? So to me, that's some of what, pulling back the studs, there are, aspects of this that we see that are successful in schools, sometimes out of school settings that we can build on.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So I'm looking at a question here that I think speaks directly to all of our work as educators in higher ed. Actually, both questions do. We'll start with Troy Pinkney's. Troy writes that as an educator of future teachers, how can we impress upon our students the need to understand their role in creating and supporting change in our education system? We need to start educating our students as soon as they enter our institutions. So what methods have been most successful from an administration point of view? Each of our colleagues here, which is interesting on this call, have administrative roles as director of programs and heads of departments and programs. So I wonder what ways you all have thought about it, not only individually within your classes, but also from a programmatic view of how you do that work. I know, Cliff, you might be able to really speak to this given the work that you all have done in for the Teaching Credential Program, which was a large programmatic shift. So maybe you might want to start us off.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand the question a little bit. So,
what methods have been most successful from an administrative point of view? So more programmatic, not just your class or your research, to really get teachers, students preparing to be teachers to understand the role of having, creating and supporting change in the education system.
Man, that it's hard because I feel like it's in the water and the air of everything we do.
Right. Some
And
people are in different water. What's in our water?
and I think that, you know, from my experience, having been a part of a bunch of different teacher education programs, it's like, it takes a community. Like if you're finding that you're fighting within yourselves or within different people, it's obviously much more difficult. It's psychologically weighs on you heavily. If you've got a team of folks and, you know, both horizontally and vertically, that obviously makes things a lot easier in pushing for some of the things that we know in practice works well. I feel like on a very personal level, like sometimes, you know, it's important for you to have that role in pushing for change, but there also comes to a point when you're like, you know what, this is eating away at my soul to some point, and that like I need to have certain level of self-preservation, and like where can I find the outlet with the community of folks that is doing the work. And I think like what Dr. Love discussed, the Abolitionist Teaching Network, I know many other groups that support teachers and administrators with the social justice perspective. That is so, you know, critical for us to be able to continue to do the work. Because I kind of always think of it as not just like the, you know, what's going to happen a year from now, but like what's the 10-year? Am I even going to be in this role? And I want to give a shout out to Musham at East Bay Meditation Center. She wrote a piece about like how to avoid burnout for social justice activists. And it's like, we need to think of the long-term, you know, the eyes on the prize perspective. Is if we're so burnt out from doing this work in the short term, we can't do it for the lifetime. And we need to think about that too.
Dana, and your program is focused on educational leadership and preparing folks, particularly for their administrative services credential. And so really thinking about that sort of wider view that a leader must take into an institutional, organizational sort of viewpoint around these types of shifts and changes. How do you get that large view into a classroom and into a practice and a curriculum or into a syllabus? What are some of your thoughts about that?
You know, for my class I'm teaching this semester, we're reading theories that are Black women, feminist theories, that are queer, people of color theories, that are critical race theories, indigenous critical theories, right? And Latinx and Asian and Black, and, you know, so and also disability studies, right? And trans, you know, so we're actually, because in curriculum studies, right, there's all of that theory. So if you're gonna lead teachers, you need to have the current critical race theory and other intersecting theories, right? Critical theories. So, you know, they're reading the discrit theories and all of that around disability rights so that they can create policies and practices in their institution. But we also talk about not doing it as a lone wolf, right? So the collaborative, taking a pulse, the same things that actually we're talking about when we're talking about young people, right? You know, and participatory action research can be at any age. You know, I tend to focus a lot on with young people in collaboration, but, you know, actually taking the pulse, right? And asking other people to be at the table, and dismantling that model of top down or expert at the top trying to figure it out, because the flaws of that one person at the top of a system are going to be the flaws of the system, right? And we all have flaws, or areas for growth to work on as humans, right? And so having a collective and having, you know, janitors, having parents, having other people that work in the school, cafeteria workers, right? Having students, there are models out there where there are actual schools where they have a lot to say about the curriculum because it's impacting, you know, they're part of the community. And so bringing all of those different stakeholders together is one piece. And then I'll just say, you know, a lot of these silos, like I think what's exciting about the kind of hard moment that we're in, you know, as a society right now, is it's laying bare a lot of these interconnections and breaking down a lot of those silos that we tend to, in some ways in this professional way, compartmentalize, right? And so I think for educational leaders, it's very similar to for, you know, students or YPAR, Participatory Action Research, or youth organizers, right? That some of the community methods, looking at the root causes, and then looking at the ideological shifts that need to happen, and doing it with the collective, right? And taking action is going to be bit by bit.
Mm-hmm.
But we also look at a lot of examples, because, I think the theory can sound great, but then looking at when that's happening, and sometimes it is messy, and I appreciate a lot of the, books and research that kind of highlight it doesn't always look amazing, and we make mistakes, but also, thinking about how to do that work, and usually feeding ourselves, can really help us connecting to that joy, connecting to the vision, and not having to hold it all yourself.
That's right. I think our last question will go to Natalee, and Natalee, it's written by one of our colleagues, Colin Schatz, which I think is really wonderful. Colin's one of the faculty here at Mills. Colin writes, I appreciated a much earlier comment by Natalee. I think about students starting college not being different in their needs and humanity than they were 1 year earlier, if following the so-called traditional age education trajectory. What does tearing the metaphorical house down to the studs and building it again around liberation, joy, etc., look like in higher ed institutions? Where is doing that work effectively, especially outside spaces like schools of education, ethnic studies programs, etc., that are often doing that work already or engaged deeply in those ideas?
Yeah.
Y'all seen these ideas in other spaces, in science departments, in chemistry departments? What do you think?
No, I pretty much stick to the education and ethnic studies departments. I mean, I spent a good time in the English departments also. I think of that because so my trajectory was, I spent the first decade of my career teaching little ones, right? Fourth graders. So I was very clear, these are children, right? Like, these are children, they need to be loved. They want my approval, my love, my caring, right? And then I made the decision to teach middle school. Ooh, that was something else. But about 4 or 5 months in, I remember, I can viscerally remember looking at this kid who was about a foot taller than me with this little kind of mustache growing, And I said to him, like, do you want a hug? Like, it was just, and he just kind of like, he lost, like, his whole face changed, right? It was like such a kind of destabilizing moment for him. But I realized in that moment, like, you're just a little bit bigger, right? But it's not like all of a sudden one day, like, you don't want to be seen and loved, and like, you're still a baby, And then I think back to when I was in middle school and college, and I knew I was grown. I remember as a 7th grader telling my teacher I was grown. I mean, it's such an embarrassing moment and realization that they're still out there knowing that. But, I've had college students sitting in my office, and I remember in my first semester at Mills, and one of them said to me, there were 2 of them on the little couch in my office, and one of them said to me, she's like, hey, we're still just babies. And the other one looked at her and said, thank you. And I looked at them and I was like, you are. And it's hard to find that balance at the college level, right? Because it can become really condescending. Mm-hmm. But they're still, they're still growing and developing if you're a traditional college age student, right? Like, that prefrontal cortex is not done building, like, you're not done yet, right? And so we have to find that balance between how do we support these folks as young adults? How do we still see them as, growing human beings who really want us to care for them, right? Like, college level, I feel like it's so transactional, right? It's like, in each department you go to, I'm the expert, I'm going to give you the information, you're going to leave, you might come to my office hours. But how do we bring that ethic of care, right? How do we care for our students? Like, that doesn't disappear, it doesn't change just because time passes, right? There's not a moment in the time between, preschool and graduate school even, where a human all of a sudden, has this physiological or mental change, right? So, I haven't been in a lot of science or math departments. I definitely see it here at Mills, and I've been in the English department, right? Like, there's definitely an ethic of care of, we're gonna hold you to these really high standards because we're not gonna try to keep you from getting access to the curriculum that's often denied to people who look like you. but we're also going to be realistic, and we're going to meet you where you're at, and we're going to try to find, Mills, I think, does a really good job at this. Like we need a food pantry. We're going to create a food pantry. Like we need to talk about housing. We're in a pandemic, right? So many of our Black and Native students, our migrant students, our first gen students have lost their jobs and lost their housing, and they're struggling, right? So, I think it happens in pockets. It's just, I feel like it's a paradigm shift that needs to happen in higher ed, right? Like there's this idea that those of us who are in higher ed, we're receiving fully formed adults, and it's their responsibility, right? Like professors have said this to me as a student, like, you paid for this class, do the work or leave, right? Or like, you know what I mean? Like, it's very much like, now you've become an American because individualism is the way, and I'm not here to care, you know what I mean? And I don't know. So, and I think that my seeing higher ed that way is very much because I spent, the majority of like my 20s and 30s, like working with little ones. Mm-hmm. And I've even taught, when I was at Berkeley, I had 2 students in my class who had been my 4th graders many years prior, So having that perspective, now having kids who are in school, right? Like it changes the way that I see them, right? And it's always a daily balance of like, how can you really care for your students and support them with all the resources that you have, and also acknowledge the fact that like they are grown, right? And some of them are older than me, right? But that doesn't mean that they then still don't need that care and that being seen as human, right? That understanding that life happens, and I'm not this is Freire, right? Like, I'm not just like the holder of knowledge to dispense into your empty vessel or your blank slate or whatever it is.
We are coming toward the end, and I just want to thank each of you for sharing so honestly and so candidly at times your thinking and your thoughts about what this work is in this moment right now. And I guess to close out, I'd like your final words. We're in the middle of a horrid situation. We've been calling it multiple pandemics. We've been calling it multiple crises. We've been talking about the pandemic that never ended in terms of racial injustice and just degradation of Black, brown, and Indigenous bodies on this planet, on this earth, all the rest. We're all trying to enter into a school year, right? That is quite fraught. And for us here at Mills, this is our first week of school. Many districts across in our local area began just a week or so before. Some were delayed in starting as we're trying to figure out how to teach in this moment. And across our nation, the start of the term will begin in fits and starts, it seems. For the 3 of you, when you think about this notion of abolitionist teaching and going into the term, what are you hoping for? What are you dreaming for? Dr. Love talked about freedom dreams. What are your freedom dreams for yourself, for your students, for all of the students? What are your final words with that as an inspiration for those thoughts? Okay.
I think that, like, as educators, a big role for us is, if we're supposedly the knowledge experts in our discipline area, it's imperative for you to take your knowledge of these standards, this knowledge, these skills that you're trying to teach, but to couch it in a way that is community responsive, culturally responsive. And it looks like many different ways. Like, it means definitely going beyond, outside the box, to create projects and work that doesn't just reinscribe the same things that demonstrated in the classroom, but building on all of the things that Natalee shared. And I just think of this one project that this software engineer, Mark Korostoff, he wanted to show wealth shown to scale. He utilized his knowledge of software engineering programming in order to push how extreme wealth inequality is.
Final thoughts, freedom dreams moving forward this year in this context, teaching now.
I just want to figure out how we as an institution can support the families and the community around us. Mm-hmm. Right. So there are a lot of families who are struggling with caring for their children, educating their children. Right. And then here at Mills, we have this wealth of college students who are also out of work. right? So I have this dream of how can we actually bring those two worlds together so that it benefits the community, right? So how can we maybe find a way to pay those college students, right? Like imagine if all the universities in California or across the country said something like, you know what, your room and board is covered for this year. And in exchange, we'd like you to give 10 hours to the community, right? Like, and here are the families who are in the greatest need. We spoke to the school districts, we spoke to the teachers. And maybe it's tutoring those families, but maybe it's just checking in with those families, you know, or maybe it's a little bit of both. Mm-hmm. And at Mills, we're in such a, you know, we have this I can't think of the right adjective, but we have the advantage of having so many Oakland students actually being our students now. So we're just sending them back into their own communities, but giving them then, again, that wealth, right, that capital, that money to support them in finishing their studies, right? But also going into the community and supporting the students whose families can't hire nannies and tutors and learning pods and, you know, all of those things. So that's my dream right now, is right. It's like to figure out how we can take everyone's strengths and everyone's needs and, you know, just build on it. Use what the community knows and use what we know. Use that knowledge combined to really, you know, do something radical. Like we have an opportunity to remake schools right now because they're being remade whether we like it or not.
That's right. Dana, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, my final thought would just be, you know, we're creating these spaces in our classrooms and in our larger communities. But I'm also always inspired by being connected to other people who are creating spaces, right? So, and in different ways, and that can include artists and many others. You know, and I'm writing about this a little bit now, so I'm steeped in it, but like a co-edited book that's coming out around using art as a vehicle for social change is really inspiring me to think of some of those, you know, I think about Inner City Struggle in Los Angeles, on the east side of Los Angeles, and Project South and Highlander, and all of these different places, organizations that are in the book of YR Media that Cliff Lee mentioned, that are talking about the important work here in Oakland that they're doing. And to me, being connected to others who are doing that work just grounds me and has always grounded me in my own work, right? And trying to know that, you know, sometimes it's messy or it's imperfect, but that we're trying to, you know, create these collective spaces, and that it's going to take time, but that we can also link up others who are doing that work. So that's what kind of inspires me starting a new year during this time.
Awesome. Cliff, did you want to add anything as we're closing out, or how are you feeling?
I think I said it enough, but yeah, I love the idea of just dreaming of a brighter future. Think beyond the chains that shackle our minds.
Thank you all so much for tuning in to our webinar here, our teaching conversation. Really appreciate the questions that you've offered to push us along in our thinking, and also just the support and engagement that you've had with one another in the chat. It's been really lovely to be in community with you today on this very historic day, and to be marching forward with you, moving forward. Have a wonderful day. Be well.
Thank you, Dr. Williams.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for organizing. And thank you to Dr. Love for being here.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks to Dr. Williams and Dr. Love. Take care.
And Gabby and Urea. Bye.